Have you ever wondered what happens when a soul pushed to the absolute edge finds the courage to do what nobody else dared? What if I told you that in the muggy summer of 1852, in the heart of Charleston, South Carolina, something happened that made the entire slaveholding aristocracy tremble in their beds at night? Something so terrifying that newspapers were ordered to stop printing, that court records mysteriously vanished, and that even today, historians argue about what truly transpired within those whitewashed walls? This is not your typical history lesson. This is the story they never wanted you to know. The story of a man whose name was nearly erased from existence, whose deeds were so extraordinary that the powerful men of Charleston decided the world could never learn the full truth. But truth, like water, finds its way through every crack. And tonight, I'm going to share with you every detail that has survived the deliberate destruction, every whispered account that defied the silence, every fragment of evidence that points to one of the most remarkable acts of resistance ever recorded on American soil. If you are the kind of person who believes that courage transcends circumstance, that the human spirit can accomplish the impossible, that some stories deserve to be told no matter how hard they tried to bury them, then you are exactly where you need to be right now. Hit that subscribe button because what you are about to hear will stay with you forever. And if by the end of this story your heart is not pounding, if you do not feel the weight of what this man endured and what he accomplished, then I will have failed in my sacred duty to honor his memory. But I do not intend to fail. Not tonight. Not with this story. His name was Solomon, and Charleston has never forgotten what he did, even though they tried desperately to make sure you never heard about it. The ruins still stand if you know where to look. On the outskirts of what was once the Harrington Plantation, about 17 miles northwest of Charleston proper, where the Ashley River curves like a sleeping serpent through the Carolina Lowcountry, there remains a chimney. Just a chimney now, blackened brick rising from the earth like a finger pointing accusingly at the sky, surrounded by live oaks draped in Spanish moss that sways in the humid breeze like the hair of mourning widows. The main house is gone. The slave quarters are gone. The sugar processing buildings, the stables, the overseer's cottage, all reduced to foundations that the forest has been slowly reclaiming for nearly 2 centuries. But that chimney stands. And if you press your palm against those bricks on a summer evening, locals will tell you that the stones still feel warm, not from the sun, from something else entirely, from the fire that consumed this place on the night of August 14th, 1852. From the flames that announced to the sleeping aristocracy of Charleston that their world was not as secure as they believed, that their power was not as absolute as they proclaimed, that a single man with nothing left to lose could bring an empire to its knees. The story you are about to hear has been pieced together from fragments. A partial court transcript discovered in 1923 in a tobacco barn in Georgetown County, water-damaged, but legible. Letters exchanged between plantation owners in the weeks following the incident, letters filled with fear disguised as outrage. Oral histories collected by WPA workers in the 1930s from the descendants of those who were there, descendants who had been passing the story down for generations in whispered tones, keeping the flame of memory alive when the official record keepers tried to extinguish it. And most remarkably, a diary entry from the Harrington family itself, written by a teenage daughter who witnessed far more than her parents ever knew. A diary that surfaced at a Savannah estate sale in 1987 and changed everything historians thought they understood about that terrible and magnificent night. If you want to accompany more cases like this one, cases that shake the foundations of society and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to this channel so you do not miss a single investigation. This is the thesis that will guide us through the darkness. That sometimes in the mathematics of human suffering, an equation emerges where the cost of continued endurance exceeds the price of the most extreme action. And in that moment, ordinary people discover capacities within themselves that rewrite the rules of what is possible. Solomon discovered that capacity, and Charleston discovered that their slaves were not the docile, grateful servants they had convinced themselves they owned, but human beings capable of a righteous fury that could level mansions and rewrite destinies. The Harrington Plantation sprawled across 1,800 acres of prime low-country real estate, a kingdom unto itself, in an era when such kingdoms dotted the southern landscape like feudal domains, transported across the Atlantic and replanted in American soil. The main house rose 3 stories high, gleaming white columns supporting a portico that could shelter 40 guests from the Carolina sun, a testament to the wealth extracted from the labor of 237 enslaved souls who worked the rice and cotton fields from before dawn until after darkness fell. The patriarch was Cornelius Harrington III, a man whose family had been accumulating land and human beings since his great-grandfather stepped off a ship from Bristol in 1698 with nothing but ambition and a letter of introduction to the colonial governor. By 1852, the Harringtons were among the 10 wealthiest families in South Carolina, their fortune built on the broken backs of generations of enslaved people, their social standing cemented by strategic marriages into other planter dynasties, their political influence extending to the state legislature and beyond. Cornelius himself was 53 years old in that fateful summer, a man of middling height but imposing presence, with gray mutton chop whiskers and cold blue eyes that seemed to assess everything they observed for its potential value or threat. He fancied himself a benevolent master, the worst kind of slaveholder because he genuinely believed his own mythology. He spoke of his slaves as his family, his children, his sacred responsibility, even as he sold children away from their mothers when financial pressures demanded it, even as he turned a blind eye to the brutalities inflicted by his overseers, even as he built his mansion and filled it with European furniture purchased with the proceeds of stolen lives and stolen labor. His wife, Margaret Harrington, was a Charleston belle who had brought substantial property of her own into the marriage, including the 47 enslaved people she inherited from her father's estate. She concerned herself primarily with social obligations and the proper raising of their 4 children, rarely venturing to the fields or slave quarters, preferring to imagine that the elaborate system of oppression that funded her silk dresses and imported china functioned through something resembling mutual agreement rather than constant violence and the threat of worse. Their eldest son, William, was 24 and already demonstrating the casual cruelty that would make him notorious among the enslaved population within 2 years of assuming management of certain plantation operations. Their eldest daughter, Catherine, was 22, recently married to a rice planter from Georgetown, already establishing her own household of horrors 60 miles up the coast. The younger son, Thomas, was 19 and studying law in Charleston, destined for politics. And the youngest, Mary, was just 16, a quiet girl who spent more time with books than with the social obligations her mother considered appropriate, a girl who observed far more than anyone realized, and who would commit her observations to paper in a diary that would survive the burning when so much else did not. The man who would bring this dynasty to its knees arrived at the Harrington plantation in the spring of 1847, purchased at a Charleston slave auction for $850. He gave his name as Solomon. No surname, of course. Enslaved people were rarely granted that dignity. The auction records described him as approximately 28 years of age, 6 feet and 1 inch tall, 190 pounds, with a scar across his left cheekbone and hands that showed evidence of skilled labor rather than pure field work. He had been sold from an estate in Virginia following the death of its owner, separated from whatever connections and community he had built during the first quarter century of his life, transported south to begin again in a strange land among unfamiliar faces. What the auction records did not capture, what Cornelius Harrington discovered only gradually over the following months, was that Solomon possessed abilities that made him extraordinarily valuable. He could read and write, skills he had somehow acquired and carefully concealed because literacy among the enslaved was illegal throughout the South, punishable by whipping for the learner and prosecution for any white person who might have taught them. He had training as a blacksmith from his previous enslavement, capable of forging and repairing the iron implements that every plantation required in abundance. He understood basic veterinary medicine, could treat sick horses and mules with a mixture of traditional knowledge and sharp observation. He could do carpentry, masonry, leatherworking. He could repair machinery, maintain equipment, solve problems that stumped the white overseers who supposedly managed the enslaved workforce. Cornelius Harrington recognized this value immediately. Within 6 months of his purchase, Solomon was removed from field labor and assigned to the blacksmith shop, a small building near the main house where he would spend his days forging horseshoes and hinges, repairing plows and wagon wheels, maintaining the metal infrastructure that kept the plantation functioning. It was a position of relative privilege in the brutal hierarchy of slavery, offering shelter from the worst of the weather, reduced physical exhaustion compared to the endless rhythms of planting and harvesting, and most importantly, a degree of mobility and access that few enslaved people ever enjoyed. Because the blacksmith was essential, Solomon was allowed to move throughout the plantation with minimal supervision. Because equipment broke everywhere, he traveled between the fields and the main house, the slave quarters and the overseer's cottage, the stables and the processing buildings. Because machinery did not respect calendars or daylight hours, he was sometimes required to work after darkness fell, moving through the plantation with a lantern and his tools while others slept. He saw everything. He heard everything. He knew which overseers drank themselves insensible by 9 in the evening. He knew which doors were left unlocked and which windows could be opened silently from outside. He knew where Cornelius Harrington kept his firearms and where the keys to the various locked buildings hung during the night. And he remembered everything. In the leather apron he wore while working at the forge, in a hidden pocket he had sewn himself, he kept a small notebook and a stub of pencil. Whenever he was alone, he wrote observations, schedules, names, routines. He was creating a map of the plantation's vulnerabilities, though he himself may not have fully understood, in those early years, what purpose that map might ultimately serve. Leave a comment below saying, "Never give up on truth," if you believe that justice must reach all the oppressed. The Harrington plantation operated on a rhythm as predictable as the tides that push salt water up the Ashley River twice each day. The work bell rang at 4:30 in the morning during planting and harvest seasons, summoning the enslaved from their quarters to begin another day of labor that would not end until the sun fell below the live oaks to the west. Each enslaved person received a daily task, a specified amount of work that had to be completed regardless of how long it took, a system that the planters claimed was more humane than the gang labor used on other plantations, because it theoretically allowed workers who finished quickly to have time to themselves. In practice, the task system was simply another form of control. Tasks were set at levels that required 10 to 12 hours of intensive labor to complete, leaving the enslaved exhausted with barely enough time to tend their own small garden plots, prepare their meager food rations, and collapse into a few hours of sleep before the bell summoned them again. Those who failed to complete their tasks faced the whip. Those who completed them quickly found their tasks increased until they too were working until exhaustion. The system was designed to extract maximum labor while maintaining the illusion of reasonableness, and it functioned exactly as designed. The driver of the field hands was a man named Big James, himself enslaved but granted authority over others, a position that required him to navigate the impossible terrain between the demands of the white overseers above him and the suffering of his fellow captives below. Big James carried a whip but rarely used it, preferring to maintain discipline through the force of his presence and the respect he had earned over 2 decades at Harrington. But everyone understood that if he did not demonstrate sufficient severity, the white overseer would replace him with someone willing to be more brutal, or would simply take over the punishment himself with far less restraint. The head overseer was a poor white man from the Georgia upcountry named Josiah Blackwood, a man who had failed at farming his own small plot and descended to the degradation of overseeing others' human property for wages. Blackwood compensated for his low social status through excessive cruelty, demonstrating his authority through violence in ways that made even Cornelius Harrington occasionally uncomfortable, though never uncomfortable enough to dismiss him. Blackwood carried a cowhide whip, a hickory cane, and a pistol, and he had occasion to use all 3 in the course of his duties. The enslaved population hated him with a purity of emotion that left no room for ambiguity, and Blackwood seemed to feed on that hatred, to grow stronger and meaner the more he was despised. Beneath Blackwood served 2 assistant overseers, younger white men learning the trade of human management, and below them, the drivers like Big James, who occupied the impossible middle ground between worlds. This hierarchy was mirrored in the domestic sphere, where a woman named Aunt Celia, in her 60s by 1852, managed the household enslaved workers with a combination of dignity and pragmatism that allowed her to protect those under her supervision as much as circumstances permitted. Aunt Celia had been at Harrington since she was a child, had nursed Margaret Harrington's own children at her breast, and occupied a position of complicated privilege and powerlessness that characterized the lives of those who worked in the main house. The slave quarters consisted of 23 cabins arranged in 2 rows along a dirt path about a quarter mile from the main house, far enough that the sounds and smells of enslaved life did not intrude upon the Harrington family's carefully cultivated atmosphere of gentility, close enough for effective surveillance and control. Each cabin measured approximately 16 feet by 18 feet and housed between 6 and 12 people depending on family configurations and the plantation's current population. The floors were packed earth. The walls were rough-hewn timber with gaps that admitted wind and rain and insects. The roofs were split wooden shakes that leaked during heavy storms. Each cabin contained a fireplace for cooking and warmth, a few pieces of simple furniture that the inhabitants had mostly built themselves, and whatever personal possessions the enslaved had managed to accumulate or create. It was in the third cabin on the northern row that Solomon lived, sharing the space with 5 other unmarried men who worked various positions around the plantation. He had been offered slightly better accommodations near the blacksmith shop itself, but he declined, preferring to maintain his connections to the broader enslaved community rather than accepting the isolation that came with visible privilege. This decision would prove significant in the events that followed, for it was in that cabin, in whispered conversations after darkness fell, that the first seeds of coordinated resistance began to take root. Solomon watched and waited. For 5 years he watched and waited. He observed the patterns, learned the vulnerabilities, built relationships based on trust that had to be earned slowly because the cost of misplaced trust could be torture or death. He became known throughout the enslaved community as a man who could be relied upon, who would share his relative privileges, who would use his mobility to carry messages and information, who would risk punishment to help others. He repaired tools for fellow enslaved people during his own time. He used his access to scavenge small items that improved daily life in the quarters. He taught others to read in secret nighttime sessions that could have cost everyone involved their lives. And he documented the horrors. Every beating he witnessed, he recorded. Every family separated, noted. Every indignity, every humiliation, every crime against human dignity that characterized the daily operation of the Harrington plantation found its way into his hidden notebook, a chronicle of suffering that would one day serve as both indictment and inspiration. The young daughter of the house, Mary Harrington, observed Solomon more closely than anyone realized. In her diary, she wrote of seeing him move through the plantation with what she described as the watchfulness of a hunting cat, his eyes always moving, always assessing, even as his hands performed the mechanical work of his trade. She noted that he was treated with unusual respect by the other enslaved people, that they sought him out for advice and assistance, that there seemed to be a communication network operating just beneath the surface of plantation life with Solomon at its center. She was too young and too sheltered to fully understand what she was observing, but she recorded it faithfully, and her records would become crucial testimony when historians finally began piecing together the events that followed. In the summer of 1851, the circumstances began to shift. A new assistant overseer arrived at Harrington, a young man named Fletcher Cobb, who had grown up on a smaller plantation in the Beaufort district and come to Charleston seeking opportunity in the management of enslaved labor. Cobb was 21 years old, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the meanness that twisted his features whenever he looked at black skin. Where Josiah Blackwood's cruelty stemmed from compensation for his own low status, Cobb's cruelty seemed to emerge from something darker, a genuine pleasure in inflicting pain that the other overseers recognized and tacitly avoided examining too closely. Cobb's attention fixed on a young woman named Dinah, 18 years old, the daughter of Big James, the driver, and his wife Rachel, who worked in the laundry. Dinah had grown up on the Harrington plantation, had never known any other life, but she had inherited her father's dignified bearing and her mother's quiet strength. She worked in the fields during planting and harvest, in the main house kitchen during the slower seasons, a position that brought her into proximity with the white household and, inevitably, into the notice of Fletcher Cobb. What followed over the next several months was a pattern so common in the antebellum South that it barely registered in the official record, yet so devastating to those who experienced it that its effects echoed through generations. Cobb pursued Dinah with the persistent entitlement of a man who had been raised to believe that enslaved women existed for his pleasure, that their bodies were property to be used, and their protests were impudence to be punished. Dinah resisted as much as resistance was possible, avoiding him when she could, enduring when avoidance failed, maintaining a dignity under assault that enraged Cobb further, because he could violate her body, but could not break what remained invulnerable within her spirit. Big James knew what was happening. Everyone in the quarters knew. But there was nothing to be done within the system that enslaved them. A complaint to Cornelius Harrington would be seen as impudence at best, might result in Dinah being sold away from her family as a troublemaker, might result in punishment for Big James for failing to control his daughter's supposed provocations. The enslaved had no legal standing to charge a white man with any crime, could not testify in court against white people, could not appeal to any authority that would recognize their humanity or their suffering. Solomon watched this unfold with a cold fury that he hid behind the impassive expression he had cultivated over years of survival. He continued his work at the forge, continued his rounds throughout the plantation, continued adding entries to his hidden notebook, but something had changed in the quality of his attention. He was no longer simply documenting, he was beginning to plan. The breaking point came in January 1852. Dinah discovered she was pregnant. This fact could not be hidden for long, and when it became apparent, the consequences cascaded with devastating predictability. Margaret Harrington, maintaining the fiction that she did not understand how such things happened on her plantation, expressed disappointment that one of her kitchen workers had been corrupted. Cornelius Harrington made vague comments about declining moral standards among the enslaved. Fletcher Cobb, far from being punished, seemed to swagger with greater confidence, having demonstrated his power in the most primal way available. Big James confronted Cobb directly, an action so dangerous that it surprised everyone who heard about it afterward. He found the young overseer behind the stables one evening in late January, and spoke words that no enslaved person was supposed to speak to a white man, words about honor and manhood, and the judgment that awaited those who preyed upon the helpless. Cobb responded by beating Big James with the hickory cane he carried, beating him until the older man lay bleeding in the dirt, then summoning Josiah Blackwood to administer additional punishment for the offense of addressing a white man without proper deference. That night, Big James received 30 lashes at the whipping post in the center of the quarters, a post positioned there precisely so that all the enslaved could witness what happened to those who stepped out of line. His wife Rachel and his daughter Dinah were forced to watch, as were all the other enslaved people on the plantation, pulled from their cabins to observe the consequences of resistance. Big James made no sound throughout the whipping, maintaining a silence that the enslaved understood as its own form of defiance, but his blood soaked into the packed earth around the post, and when they cut him down, he could not walk unaided. Solomon was among those who carried Big James back to his cabin that night. He was among those who helped Rachel clean and dress the wounds, who sat through the hours of fever that followed. And it was that night, in that cabin, with the smell of blood and the sound of suppressed weeping filling the space, that something crystallized in Solomon's mind. 5 years of watching, 5 years of planning, 5 years of accumulating knowledge and building trust had led to this moment of clarity. Nothing would change within the system. The only possibility for change existed outside the system entirely, in actions so dramatic that they would shatter the framework of normal operation and create space for something different to emerge. He did not share his thoughts that night. The time was not yet right. But he began to prepare. In the months that followed, Solomon's behavior changed in subtle ways that only the most observant might notice. He volunteered for additional tasks that extended his access throughout the plantation. He cultivated relationships with enslaved people on neighboring properties when the opportunity arose, building a network of communication and potential support. He studied the movements of the white household with new intensity, noting when Cornelius Harrington traveled to Charleston on business, when William Harrington was absent pursuing his own affairs, when the various overseers were likely to be distracted or incapacitated. He also began making specific preparations at the forge. In the hours when he was supposed to be sleeping, he crafted objects that had no legitimate purpose on a plantation. Keys copied from impressions he had made of locks throughout the property, thin metal tools that could pry open windows or slip through door cracks, small blades that could be concealed in clothing or hidden in the quarters against future need. Each item was carefully hidden, distributed among trusted allies, added to an arsenal that grew slowly but steadily as winter turned to spring and spring gave way to the brutal heat of Carolina summer. The catalyst that transformed planning into action arrived on August 3, 1852, in the form of a routine event that carried extraordinary consequences. Dinah gave birth to a child, a boy with light skin that testified unmistakably to his parentage. The birth itself was uneventful, attended by the older women in the quarters who served as midwives for the enslaved community. But 2 days later, Fletcher Cobb came to the cabin where Dinah lay recovering and took the infant from her arms. He took the child to Cornelius Harrington in the main house and presented it as evidence of his own virility, proof of his capacity to increase the master's property through the reproduction of the enslaved. Harrington, uncomfortable with the directness of this presentation but unwilling to acknowledge why, agreed to register the child as plantation property. The infant would be raised in the quarters, would join the workforce as soon as he was able, would live and die as human property unless circumstance intervened. This was the ordinary operation of the system, so ordinary that it barely merited comment among the white household. But Cobb was not satisfied with the ordinary. In a display of dominance that even Josiah Blackwood considered excessive, he demanded that the child be named after him, demanded that Dinah bring the infant to the main house each week so that he could inspect his offspring, demanded acknowledgement of his paternity as a form of ongoing humiliation that kept Dinah subordinated and Big James powerless. And on August 10th, when Rachel attempted to intervene in one of these inspection visits, Cobb struck her so hard that she fell against a door frame and did not rise for several minutes, bleeding from a gash on her forehead. Solomon learned of this incident within hours. By that evening he had made his decision. The time for waiting was over. The time for action had arrived. Over the next 3 days, Solomon moved through the plantation with the methodical precision of a man who had rehearsed his actions 1,000 times in his mind. He spoke with trusted allies in whispered conversations that conveyed information through codes and phrases developed over years of careful communication. He distributed the items he had prepared, the keys and tools and blades that had been waiting for this moment. He outlined a plan that was audacious in its scope, but grounded in the detailed knowledge he had accumulated through years of observation. The date he selected was August 14th, a Saturday night. On Saturday evenings, the white household typically relaxed their vigilance. Cornelius Harrington permitted the enslaved a rare half-day of rest on Sundays, which meant Saturday nights in the quarters often featured small gatherings where people cooked shared meals from their garden plots, sang songs, maintained the cultural connections that slavery tried constantly to sever. The overseers knew about these gatherings and generally looked the other way as long as they did not become too loud or last too late, a small pressure release valve in the system of total control. On this particular Saturday, Solomon knew William Harrington was in Charleston pursuing entertainment that his mother pretended not to know about. Thomas Harrington was with his brother, similarly engaged. Cornelius Harrington had spent the afternoon in his study with a bottle of brandy, celebrating a profitable cotton sale, and was expected to retire early and sleep heavily. Margaret Harrington suffered from a nervous condition that required laudanum before bed, ensuring she would be insensible until morning. Only young Mary Harrington, with her watchful eyes and her hidden diary, was likely to be alert in the main house, and she was a 16-year-old girl with no weapon and no means of raising alarm quickly enough to make a difference. Josiah Blackwood had gone to Charleston himself that afternoon to collect supplies, a journey that would keep him away until late Sunday. Fletcher Cobb was present, occupying the assistant overseer's cottage with a bottle of whiskey for company. But one man could be managed, especially if surprised properly. The other assistant overseer was new, barely familiar with the plantation, and slept like the dead according to reports from the enslaved who cleaned his quarters. The conditions would never be more favorable. Solomon gathered his core group of conspirators, 7 men and 2 women who had committed themselves fully to the plan, and finalized the details. They would move at midnight when the quarter moon had set and darkness covered the plantation like a blanket. They would secure the overseers first, then the main house. They would take weapons, horses, money, supplies, and then they would burn it all, every building connected to the Harrington family's enterprise of human bondage, until nothing remained but ash and memory. The plan was not primarily about escape, though escape was part of it. The plan was about declaration, about making a statement so dramatic that it could not be ignored or forgotten, about demonstrating that the enslaved were not content in their condition, no matter how often their masters told themselves otherwise. Solomon understood that most rebellions failed, that the power arrayed against the enslaved was overwhelming, that the likely outcome was death for himself and everyone who joined him. But he also understood that some things mattered more than survival, that some statements had to be made regardless of cost, that the children growing up in those cramped cabins deserved to know that their parents had not accepted degradation quietly. As darkness fell on August 14, 1852, the Harrington plantation settled into its Saturday evening routine. Cooking fires glowed in the quarters. The sounds of conversation and occasional music drifted on the humid air. The big house stood quiet and lamplit, its white columns gleaming faintly in the starlight. Fletcher Cobb sat on the porch of the overseer's cottage, drinking steadily, unaware that he was being watched by eyes that catalogued his every movement. At 11:30, Solomon left his cabin and walked toward the blacksmith shop, a journey he had made 1,000 times, and that would attract no attention from anyone who might be watching. But instead of entering the shop, he slipped into the shadows beside it and waited. One by one, his co-conspirators emerged from the darkness, materializing from the quarters and the outbuildings with the practiced stealth of people who had learned to move silently to survive. Each carried the tools Solomon had prepared. Each knew their role in what was to come. At exactly midnight they began. The first target was Fletcher Cobb. Solomon had assigned this task to Big James, an assignment that everyone understood as both strategic and personal. Big James moved toward the overseer's cottage with 2 other men, approaching from angles that covered the windows and doors. Cobb had fallen asleep in his chair on the porch, his whiskey bottle empty beside him, his pistol lying carelessly on the table within reach, but not in hand. Big James mounted the porch steps with the silence of a ghost and struck before Cobb could open his eyes, a single blow with the hammer Solomon had forged that ended any possibility of resistance or alarm. There was no hesitation, no pause for reflection or regret. This was not murder as the law defined it, because the law did not recognize the humanity of those doing the killing or the crimes committed by the man who died. This was justice of a different order, operating by different rules, executing a sentence that no legal court would ever have pronounced, but that the moral court of the universe had long since decreed. The other assistant overseer was subdued in his bed, bound and gagged before he fully understood what was happening. He would survive the night, though he would never recover from the knowledge that he had been helpless as those he considered subhuman took control of his life. The main house came next. Solomon led this phase personally, using the key he had copied from Cornelius Harrington's own ring, entering through the rear door that led to the kitchen passage. They moved through the darkened house like shadows, shadows with weapons and purpose, securing each room before advancing to the next. Margaret Harrington slept through their passage, the laudanum ensuring her oblivion. Cornelius Harrington woke when they entered his bedroom, woke to find himself staring up at faces that his comfortable ideology insisted were incapable of the intelligence and coordination now being displayed, faces that reflected back his own terror with an expression he had never before seen on black features. Cold, calculated control. Solomon spoke to him. The exact words were not recorded, though Mary Harrington would later write that she heard voices from her parents' room, a low conversation that lasted several minutes before falling silent. What passed between the enslaved man who had been treated as property and the master who had treated him that way, we can only imagine. Perhaps Solomon recounted the documented horrors of the past 5 years, the beatings and sales and sexual assaults and systematic dehumanization. Perhaps he explained the philosophy that had led to this night, the calculus of endurance and resistance. Perhaps he simply wanted the man who had claimed ownership of his body to understand that the body was nothing, that the spirit had always remained free. When the conversation ended, Cornelius Harrington joined his wife in chemical unconsciousness, a carefully measured dose of her own laudanum, ensuring he would not interfere with subsequent events. Mary Harrington was found in her room, awake and terrified, her diary open on her desk where she had been writing by candlelight. Solomon entered alone and stood in her doorway for a long moment, looking at this child, who had been raised to see him as less than human, but who had nonetheless observed him with something approaching recognition. He told her that no harm would come to her if she remained in her room until morning. He told her to write down everything she witnessed so that the truth would survive. Then he closed the door and moved on to the next phase. The armory was opened with another of Solomon's copied keys. Rifles, pistols, powder, and shot were distributed among the conspirators. Horses were saddled in the stables, loaded with supplies gathered from the main house and the various outbuildings. Money was taken from Cornelius Harrington's strongbox, enough to fund travel and bribe passage for those who might escape to the north. Documents were collected, deeds, bills of sale, the paper evidence of human ownership, to be added to the fire that would consume everything else. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the burning began. The overseer's cottage went first, flames leaping from windows and racing across the dry wooden shingles. The assistant overseer's quarters followed. Then the sugar processing building, the cotton warehouse, the stables from which the horses had been removed. Building after building, years of accumulated wealth transformed into towers of flame that lit the August night and sent columns of smoke rising to obscure the stars. The enslaved population had been roused from the quarters and gathered at a safe distance to watch. Some knew what was happening, had been part of the planning. Most did not, had awakened to find their world on fire and their own position suddenly, terrifyingly uncertain. Solomon spoke to them now, spoke with a voice that carried over the roar of flames, spoke of freedom and dignity and the choice each of them now faced. They could stay, wait for the inevitable arrival of white authority, claim ignorance of the conspiracy, and hope for mercy from a system that had shown them precious little mercy before. Or they could go, could join the exodus that Solomon was leading north, could risk almost certain death for the chance, however slim, of reaching free soil. Some chose to stay, the elderly, mostly, who could not imagine surviving the journey. Some of the young mothers with infants too fragile for the desperate flight ahead. But others chose differently. 43 souls joined Solomon that night, forming a column that moved away from the burning plantation as the first gray light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon. Big James was among them, his back still bearing the scars of January's whipping. Rachel was there, the wound on her forehead now a badge of what she had survived. And Dinah walked beside them, her infant son pressed against her chest. A child who would grow up knowing that his first weeks of life had been marked by an act of resistance that shook the foundations of Carolina slavery. They moved north through the swamps and forests that Solomon had studied for 5 years, following routes he had mapped in his hidden notebook, avoiding roads where white patrols would be searching, traveling by night and hiding by day. They carried enough supplies for perhaps 2 weeks, enough weapons to defend themselves against small parties of pursuers, enough hope to sustain them through the impossible journey ahead. Behind them, the Harrington plantation continued to burn. The main house, which Solomon had ordered left intact so that Mary Harrington could escape safely, eventually caught fire from flying embers around 4 in the morning. Mary emerged from the front door as flames consumed the upper floors, still clutching her diary, and was found wandering the drive by neighbors who arrived at dawn, drawn by the smoke visible for miles in every direction. The news spread through Charleston like the fire itself. By noon on August 15th, every white household in the Lowcountry knew that the Harrington plantation had been destroyed by an organized slave uprising, that the overseer Fletcher Cobb was dead, that dozens of enslaved people had escaped into the wilderness, that the comfortable assumptions of planter society had been challenged in the most dramatic way possible. The response was swift and overwhelming. The state militia was mobilized within hours. Slave patrols from 6 counties converged on the area. Professional slave catchers, men who made their living hunting human beings, offered their services and their bloodhounds. A reward of $5,000 was posted for Solomon's capture, dead or alive, an enormous sum that attracted bounty hunters from as far away as Virginia and Georgia. For 11 days, Solomon and his followers evaded pursuit. They moved through the swamps of the Santee River Basin, crossed into territory that few white men knew well, used every advantage that desperation and intimate knowledge of the land could provide. They split into smaller groups to confuse the trackers, reunited at predetermined points, left false trails that sent pursuers in wrong directions. Solomon's years of planning showed in every decision, every maneuver, every narrow escape from closing traps. But the mathematics of their situation were impossible. They were 43 people, including children and elderly, moving through hostile territory with limited supplies and no safe destination within reach. The forces arrayed against them numbered in the hundreds, equipped with horses and dogs and firearms, and the full support of a society organized around their recapture. It was never a question of whether they would be caught, only when and how. The end came on August 25th in a cypress swamp about 40 miles north of Charleston. A patrol guided by tracking dogs located the main group's hiding place shortly after dawn. Solomon had positioned his people in the best defensive location available, a small island of relatively solid ground surrounded by water too deep to wade and vegetation too thick for easy passage. But it was a position that could be surrounded, and as the morning progressed, more and more militia units arrived until escape became impossible. The siege lasted 6 hours. Solomon and the men capable of fighting held off 3 attempts to storm their position, the crack of rifle fire echoing across the swamp, the acrid smell of gunpowder mixing with the organic decay of the wetland. 4 of the militia attackers were killed in these assaults, 7 more wounded. Casualties that would be remembered in Charleston with outrage for generations. Among the defenders, the losses mounted more quickly. One by one, the men who had stood with Solomon fell, until only a handful remained capable of resistance. Big James died in the 3rd assault, shot through the chest while covering the retreat of the women and children to the island's center. He fell without crying out, maintaining to his last breath the dignity that had defined his resistance. Rachel held him as he died, and those who survived would later say that she did not weep, that her face showed something beyond grief, something like fierce pride in the man she had loved for 30 years. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, with ammunition nearly exhausted and most of his fighters dead or wounded, Solomon made his final decision. He gathered the survivors, 23 people, mostly women and children, and told them to surrender. He told them to claim they had been forced to participate, that they had been held against their will, that they knew nothing of the planning. Some of them might be believed. Some of them might survive. Then he walked out alone to meet the militia. The accounts of what followed vary in their details, but agree in their essential elements. Solomon emerged from the cypress trees unarmed, his hands raised, his clothing torn and bloodstained from the fighting. He walked toward the militia line with the same deliberate dignity that had characterized his movement through the Harrington plantation for 5 years. The militia commander, a colonel from Charleston named Whitfield, ordered his men to hold their fire. Solomon stopped about 30 feet from the militia line and spoke. His exact words were recorded by multiple witnesses, though the versions differ slightly. The most commonly accepted account has him saying, "I am the one you want. The others followed where I led. Whatever justice you have, let it fall on me." He was taken into custody without further resistance. The survivors who emerged after him were bound and transported back to Charleston, where they would face their own reckonings in the days ahead. Solomon was placed in chains and loaded onto a wagon for the journey to the city, where he would stand trial for murder, arson, and insurrection, charges that carried only one possible sentence. The trial of Solomon, identified in court records only as Solomon, slave, formerly the property of Cornelius Harrington, began on September 8, 1852, and lasted 3 days. It was conducted with a pretense of legal formality that fooled no one, a predetermined proceeding whose outcome had been decided before the first witness was called. Solomon was permitted no defense attorney, was not allowed to testify on his own behalf, was denied the opportunity to call witnesses or challenge evidence. The prosecution presented its case to a jury of 12 white slaveholders, and the jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out on September 15, 1852, in the public square of Charleston as a warning to any enslaved person who might contemplate similar resistance. What happened in the week between sentencing and execution became the subject of intense speculation and eventual legend. Solomon was held in the Charleston jail, in a cell reserved for the most dangerous prisoners, guarded around the clock by armed men who understood the symbolic importance of their charge. Visitors came, ministers offering spiritual consolation, officials seeking information about possible co-conspirators still at large, curiosity seekers wanting to glimpse the man who had terrified the slave-holding aristocracy. Among the visitors, according to accounts that surfaced decades later, was Mary Harrington. The 16-year-old girl whose diary had survived the burning came to the jail 3 days before the scheduled execution, brought by an uncle who had connections to the jailers, motivated by something she could never fully explain even to herself. She spent 20 minutes in Solomon's presence, separated by iron bars, and whatever passed between them she recorded in her diary, but never spoke of publicly during her lifetime. When Mary Harrington died in 1911, at the age of 75, her diary was discovered among her effects. The entry describing her visit to Solomon's cell included these lines. He asked me if I had written everything down, and I told him I had. He said that was good, that someone needed to remember the truth. He said he was not afraid to die, that he had been dead since the day they put chains on him, and that what was about to happen was just the body catching up with what the soul had known for years. He asked me to tell his story someday, when it was safe to tell it. I promised him I would. The execution took place as scheduled on September 15, 1852, before a crowd estimated at over 3,000 people. Solomon was led to the gallows in the early morning, his hands bound, his ankles chained, surrounded by militia who feared a rescue attempt that never materialized. He climbed the steps without assistance, refused the offer of a hood, and stood facing the crowd with the same quiet dignity that had defined his entire resistance. The sheriff asked if he had any final words. Solomon's response, recorded by multiple journalists present, would echo through the decades that followed. I die a free man. I was born free in spirit, and no chain ever touched that freedom. What I did for those who could not do for themselves. Remember me not as a slave who rebelled, but as a man who refused to accept that he was ever truly enslaved. The trap dropped at 7:23 in the morning. Solomon died without struggle, his neck broken instantly by the fall. His body was left hanging until noon as a warning, then cut down and buried in an unmarked grave in the potter's field outside the city. The authorities believed that denying him a proper burial, denying his followers a place to mourn and remember, would help erase his memory from history. They were wrong. In the weeks and months that followed, something remarkable began to happen. The Harrington Uprising, as it came to be called, could not be contained within the official narrative of a criminal act properly punished. Whispered accounts spread through the enslaved communities of the Low Country, passed from plantation to plantation by the invisible networks that connected enslaved people across property lines. Solomon became a name spoken in reverence, his method studied, his courage celebrated, his sacrifice honored in the only ways available to those still in bondage. The planters noticed. Reports from the fall of 1852 document a wave of anxiety among slaveholders throughout South Carolina and beyond. There were rumors of similar plots being organized on other plantations, rumors that may or may not have been accurate, but that reflected a genuine shift in the psychological landscape of slavery. The comfortable assumption that enslaved people accepted their condition, that they were incapable of organized resistance, that the system was stable and self-perpetuating, all of these assumptions had been shattered by one man with a hidden notebook and the courage to act. 3 other uprisings occurred in the Carolina Low Country within 2 years of Solomon's execution, all of them citing his example, all of them using methods similar to those he had pioneered. None achieved the scale or impact of the Harrington incident, but together they represented something new, a coordinated consciousness of resistance that terrified the slaveholding class far more than any individual act of violence could have. The response from the authorities was predictable and brutal. New laws were passed restricting the movement of enslaved people, limiting their ability to gather, prohibiting any form of education. Slave patrols were expanded and given broader powers. Punishments for infractions were increased. The system doubled down on its violence, hoping to crush through force what could not be defeated through legitimacy. But the memory persisted. In the quarters throughout the South, Solomon's story was told and retold, evolving with each telling into something more than history, becoming myth, becoming legend. He was said to have killed not one overseer but a dozen. He was said to have fought for days rather than hours. He was said to have died with a smile on his face, prophesying the end of slavery that would come within a generation. The details changed, but the essential truth remained. A man had refused to accept what the world insisted he must accept, and in his refusal, he had demonstrated that the world could be changed. Mary Harrington kept her promise. She lived through the Civil War that vindicated everything Solomon had fought for. lived through Reconstruction and its betrayal, lived into the 20th century carrying her secret testimony. In 1908, 3 years before her death, she arranged for her diary to be deposited with the Charleston Historical Society, with instructions that it not be opened until 1952, exactly 100 years after the events it described. When scholars finally read her account, they discovered a document of extraordinary power, a first-hand witness to one of the most significant slave uprisings in American history, recorded by someone who had been raised to see the enslaved as property, but who had been forced by circumstance to recognize them as fully human. Mary's diary became the foundation for a new understanding of the Harrington Uprising, filling in details that had been deliberately suppressed, correcting myths that had accumulated over a century, restoring Solomon to his proper place in the historical record. Today, if you travel to that spot 17 miles northwest of Charleston, where the Ashley River curves through the Low Country, you will find a small historical marker. It was placed there in 1998, after decades of advocacy by descendants of those who escaped with Solomon, and by historians who recognized the significance of what happened on that August night. The marker gives the basic facts: the date, the location, the name of the man who led the uprising, the number who died, the number who escaped. But the full story cannot be contained on a roadside marker. The full story lives in the oral tradition still passed down in certain families, in the scholarship that continues to uncover new details, in the understanding that what Solomon did was not an isolated act of desperation, but part of a continuous tradition of resistance that stretched from the first slave ship to the final emancipation and beyond. The chimney still stands. If you know where to look, if you push through the undergrowth and the Spanish moss, you can find it. That blackened finger of brick pointing at the sky, all that remains of the Harrington plantation above ground. Local people say that on certain nights in August, when the humidity hangs heavy and the moon is dark, you can still smell smoke on the breeze, can still hear distant sounds that might be voices raised in determination or in song. They say Solomon walks those grounds still, not as a ghost haunting the scene of his crimes, but as a guardian watching over the land he helped to sanctify with his sacrifice. Whether you believe such stories depends on what you believe about memory, about justice, about the persistence of the human spirit in the face of systematic attempts at erasure. What cannot be doubted is that Solomon existed, that he did what the records say he did, that he died as he lived, unbowed, unbroken, unconquered in everything that truly mattered. His body lies somewhere in the potter's field outside Charleston, unmarked and unremembered by any stone, but his spirit lives wherever people refuse to accept injustice as inevitable, wherever courage rises against impossible odds, wherever the flame of human dignity burns brighter than any fire set to plantation buildings. If you have watched until this point, it is because you care about these stories that marked our nation forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end, so that I can know you, so that I can understand who truly cares about the search for historical truth." Like this video if Solomon's story touched your heart. Share it so that his memory will never be forgotten. And remember, what they tried to bury, we have brought back into the light. What they tried to silence, we have given voice. What they wanted forgotten, we have chosen to remember. Solomon lives. In every act of courage against oppression, in every refusal to accept degradation, in every voice raised against injustice, Solomon lives.